And welcome to class. Today I want to explain the characteristic that state has in terms of power, authority, and legitimacy. And after that, I wanted a little bit talk about democracy. So we will talk about democracy next week for sure, and then we will also talk about non-democracies. What's the main difference between the two? And then before that, I let's go back to our discussion. So we discussed to what extent the government can use its power of violence. We discussed that really deeply. It's because I wanted to let you know the characteristic that government has that's very unique. That is, government's violence can be legitimate. So we have to figure it out. What does that mean exactly? So we talked about like 세월호 세월 ferry incidents, and then many of you actually think that that's government's mistake, government's fault. It's because government has responsibility to protect its citizen, right? So that's the self-ferry incidents, and we talked about Itaewon incident, and many of you actually pointed out that Itaewon incident has a huge problem because government actually could know in advance that that kind of incident might happen, but government didn't do anything about it. So you actually we together conclude that government's role in terms of protection is not only prevention but also handling after the incident occurs. So it's very broad and wide. And I showed the video of Ssangyong labor union strikes. And then I also showed the video, death of Baek Nam-gi, the farmer activist. He demonstrated on the street, but because of the uh, police's water pipe, he was killed, because of police. And then we discussed whether the government has authority, or whether the government's action was justifiable or not. And many of you, some of you, of course, pointed out that since demonstrators use its violence, so maybe government can use violence against it. That's what you pointed out. And then we also talk about the handicapped persons, the handicapped people. They demonstrate on the street, not on the street, but also they demonstrated the subway, and then that causes a lot of problems for people. And then some of you thinks that that's not okay, that's not right. Some of the other people pointed out that kinds of demonstration can be justifiable because that's the only way to show their opinions throughout the demonstrations. So I think both are right and both are great discussion. But I wanted to point out that the government's violence is totally different from that of the individual. It's because of this. So we talked about we discussed about this. So let's just move to the state. So what is state? The characteristic of state, we should figure it out. The government can be defined as a set of organizations. So government has a lot of organizations, right? So they have ministries or administratives, a lot of things with their associated rules and procedures. So they have rules and procedures. So we have laws. So when they exercise their power, they have to be based on the rules and procedures that has authority to exercise the widest scope of power, the ability to impose its will on others to secure desired outcomes over a defined area. So, within South Korea, the South Korean government has authority to exercise power over people based on the rules and procedures. But do I have that or do you have that? No. Only government can have that kind of authority and power. That's the difference. The power means I want you to get on what power means throughout these definitions. And second, government both claim the rights and has ability to exercise power over all people in a defined geographic area. So within South Korea, the government has a right. So they not only they have ability or not only they have a power, but also they have a right about the power. That means if I have a power, but it doesn't mean that I have a right to exercise my power to other people. So for instance, like there is a strong guy, like he's bigger or he's stronger than I am. But is it okay for him to exercise power over me? No, it doesn't. He doesn't have a right, but he only have ability to exercise power. But it's that power cannot be justifiable because it doesn't have a right. But only government, has a right and ability to exercise power. That's the difference between individual ability to exercise power and the government. During the COVID-19 pandemic, only governments both claimed and exercised the right to close businesses and to forbid religious institutions to hold service. So this is very kind of significant sentence. So during the COVID-19, many people actually resist the government's order, but government could close down the business and close down the religious institution to hold services, right? It's because for government did that for public goods, right? So public goods or public value, because they value the public goods more than anything else. So they did that for public health, and then like many Asian countries, they value health over or collective goods uh, is more important than the private goods. That's why they could do. But who can close business? Only government. So, in if you think that the capitalism country like South Korea or other countries, so many countries are capitalist country, the government's the foremost important task is to protect property right. And where this property right come from is actually business, right? But even though the government's responsibility is to protect people and then at the same time protect property right of individual, the government could close down the business. That means how can the government could do, and then no one actually can sue against the government about it because government has a right and at the same time ability to exercise power. Almost all governments seek to have and to exercise power in order to create at least a minimal level of peace, order, collective stability, and safety. So here, peace, order, and collective stability and safety altogether, we call this public goods, right? Public goods. So almost all governments seek to have and exercise power in order to create at least minimum levels of peace or order and collective stability and safety. So if the government failed to do so, we call this kind of states failed states. And most of government actually are doing this kind of things. Like even though very poor country, they try to maintain its peace. But if they fail to, like such as Somalia or Syria kind of country, we call this failed state. Max Weber, so there are a lot of definitions, and many scholars try to define the state, but the most famous definition is by Max Weber. Max Weber defined the state as an organization of monopoly on right to use violence. So if I use violence, then I'll go to jail for sure, but government cannot, we cannot put states in the jail, right? So we put jail means actually using violence, and then only government monopoly on the right to use violence. But from that perspective, U.S. is a little bit weird because U.S. allows individuals right to have a right to use violence. So they have a gun, right? They can protect themselves. U.S. allows to do so is because there are a lot of reasons. The first reason, the Rifle Association is very powerful. They lobby the government, and then the lobby is pretty effective. So many people actually do not like the 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 law that individual can have a gun. People actually, American people, they do not like it either. And then the second, because of American history, America is very unique, have very unique history, right? So they are all immigrants, and then at the time when they arrived, the state, there was no state whatsoever, so they had to protect by themselves. So it is different. State has usually have very long history, right? But America doesn't have that. And then since America has relatively short history, so America actually allowed to have a gun. That's very unique. The this uniqueness actually came from history. So America is kind of exception, but most of country, but still we have to. The government try to figure it out if the individual use violence, whether the violence is justifiable or not. So still, it's not, the individual do not have monopoly on right to use violence in America either. But it's a little bit different because America allowed individuals to have a gun. Korea doesn't allow, right? So it's a little bit different, but it doesn't mean that the individual have a right to use violence. We always figure it out whether the violence can be justifiable or not if individuals use violence. So it's a little bit different from the government use violence. Authority is permission and conferred by laws of governing regime to exercise power. So where's government authority came from? So it's conferred by law, and if it is a democracy, who made law? Actually, the people. That means another word. Authority is permission and conferred by people to exercise power. So democracy is different from non-democracy because the authority actually came from, and that the power of the government came from the people. So government could exercise its power based on the law. So if they broke the law, then they have to be punished by that, right? So that's a little bit different from non-democracy. Non-democracy is different because in non-democracy, the leader can change the law as they wanted, right? So that's actually different from democracy. Democracy, it's not easy to change the law. To change the law, we need consensus from the people. We need permission from people. The government cannot do anything what they want. That's actually different. The governmental regulation are another type of authorized government power. the authority to tax illustrate another aspect of government power. So if we do not pay taxes, then government can put me in jail because that's one of my responsibility. And then that's actually one of the examples that government has authority over me. So tax is very tax is great example. The government always exercise power on me. So you guys pay taxes. So you, even though you do not make money when you buy something, so inside of, like, if you go to a restaurant, if you check the bill, then you can see the government uh, taxes on the specific restaurants. So you can see that, right? You pay taxes every time you buy something. So how can do that? Government do that because government have a power conferred by law, and then if it's democracy, it's by people. And the authority, the use of physical forces to directly restrain behavior is just one of the ways governments exercise power. So when the waiver say monopoly right to use violence, monopoly on the right to use violence, but it doesn't mean the violence only means physical violence. The violence has different forms. Uh, so, for instance, taxes, or I mean, they put me in jail, but put me in jail is just one of the forms. One of the forms that government use violence, and then I have to follow the laws, right? And if they do not, I mean, if I do not follow the laws, then government can do something about it. And many things. And for instance, like government close down business, that's also the authority illustration, right? So every day of life, we can see the government use their violence to us, but it doesn't mean physical violence only. It means other. I mean, it restrain our behaviors. So even though I want to do something, I can't do something what I want because our behavior is refrained by government. So we cannot do whatever we want. That's the why we can't do whatever we want because of government, and government has a right to use violence whenever they want or whenever they have to based on the law. So laws, authority, power, and us highly relate to each other in democratic country. And legitimate is different. So my violence cannot be legitimate whenever, I mean, it doesn't really matter when. So if I use violence, I'll go to jail for sure, even though the situation is a little bit weird. I mean, I don't know what kind of explain what word is right way to put, but let me read it first. Most government establish authority not only to exercise power, but also the pursuit of legitimacy. So when the government use violence, we talked about whether the behavior has legitimacy or not. So, for instance, like Sarah Ferry incidents, the government didn't do anything, and then we always talk about whether the government's behavior has a legitimate or not. But the government tried to pursue its legitimacy because they try to maintain its authority or using of power over people like that. So it means that, so for instance, if government doesn't have a legitimacy anymore, then what you want to do, you want to change the government, right? If government, so whenever the government use violence, if they do not have a legitimacy, the legitimacy usually came from the law, whether they follow the law or not. If the government lost its legitimacy, then in democratic country it's very dangerous because they can lose their power. Because people wanted to change the government. So for instance, right now, Yoon Suk-yeol has very low approving rate, and that's very dangerous signal. Why is that? Because people wanted to change the president. So that means people can change the government. So that's why they always try to pursue its legitimacy. So most government establish authority not only to exercise power but also in the pursuit of legitimacy. The term is often used to mean widespread belief that government has right to exercise power. In this sense, it can be called broad legitimacy. The concept describes the government trait. Legitimacy can also be seen from the perspective of individuals or group who make determination about whether their government is or is not legitimate, that is rightfully exercising power, or what can be called judgment about legitimacy. So I showed the video of Baek Nam-gi and I showed the video of Sanghyong strikes, and then you guys pointed out that is too much, right? That means that is too much means it doesn't sound legitimate. It doesn't look the government use violence in a legitimate way, then that means the government lost its legitimacy. Then what can you do? You can change the government, right? So that's why when they exercise their power, they want to use their power in a right way. But if country is not democracy, then they don't really care. Like look at China, they use violence and no one can actually resist. And China use violence anytime they want it. If they don't like someone, they just use violence like that way, and then they do not lose legitimacy. In either sense, legitimacy is measured in the perception of lawfulness of government action, the sense that those actions are morally appropriate and consistent with basic justice and social welfare. And at basic way is actually the law. So whether their behavior is reflected by law and at the same time moral and appropriate, consistent with basic justice and social welfare. How about our violence? Our violence can do not have authority. We do not have legitimacy. So, but at least we do not like demonstrators who use violence because we think that their behaviors are not morally appropriate. So every violence we actually judge in terms of whether that behaviors is uh, met with the basic justice or not, even for individual. But the moral standard is much higher if we apply to the government than individual. The citizens' judgment about legitimacy entailed often difficult determinations of what is or is not rightful and thus consistent with morality, justice, and social welfare. So even um, some some behaviors or some government's behavior, so for instance like Sale Ferry or Itaewon instance, so the opinions were divided into two, whether that it was right or not, right? So there's it's really hard to have consensus on the government's behavior or government's violence because we all have different opinions and our morality and the level of morality or definition of morality, definition of justice are all different. But at least the government, the least morality is actually law, right? The law was made based on what is the minimum level of justice. So at least the government's behavior, government's violence should be met in a low level. So at least they should follow the law, procedure, rules. That's the minimum level. Legitimate exercise of power. The constitutional law of government governing regime authorizes suspension of established laws and regulations, allowing government to act without defined limits on the scope of its authorized action. What does that mean? So this sentence actually, the great example of this sentence is COVID-19. So the government, as I said, government should protect our life and at the same time property right, right? But government break the law in terms of when they close down the business. They could do because of what? They wanted to protect our lives. They think that the life comes first, but other countries not. Like they think that the freedom comes first, like America. So the U.S. didn't close down much as South Korea. So here is that means sometimes the government break the laws to achieve certain goals. So they suspension of established laws and regulation means they break the laws and regulations for other means, for other things. So allowing government to act without defined limit. So they do they wanted to go beyond the law sometimes, like situation like COVID, or if war occur, probably the government will break the law, right? And is that okay? Yes, right? Sometimes the government can go beyond the law. So there are strong reasons for state to resist embarking on condition of emergency, like condition of emergency. States generally see the establishment of public security as a critical to their continued broad legitimacy. A state that cannot protect its people is likely to lose widespread sentiment that has the right to rule. So the always the government put that's why the government put security uh, in a priority. It's their priority task. That's why they sometimes break the law. So I'll discuss what is democracy, the definition of democracy in a modern times.